Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jean Bell. I direct the Advancing Practice program here at the Nonprofit Quarterly, and we're so very glad that you took the time out today to join us for this urgent conversation. It's called Beyond the Board Statement: How do boards of directors join the movement for racial justice? And it's a big and complicated question. How does a body, a leadership body, a volunteer leadership body, join the movement for racial justice? Why is it urgent that boards understand where they are right now on the journey of racial justice and how they can help lead their organizations? And we're seeing a lot of statements issued by nonprofits and for-profits alike. And Vernetta and Robin, thank you so much for using the Nonprofit Quarterly as a platform to host this conversation. It's really the part one of two conversations. So we're dedicating 90 minutes today and 90 minutes next Monday to this conversation, specifically about what do we mean by the movement for racial justice as it pertains to boards of directors? And how do we not only consider the board statement of solidarity, but think beyond that to the racial justice work that our boards and our organizations need to do? Let me get us situated in terms of logistics before we dive into the content. As always, we're recording this session, so you will be sent the slides and the recording in a couple of days. Also, a little bit of suggested reading that Vernetta and Robin have lifted up. There's a hashtag if you want to share comments on social media. Please use hashtag NPQBoards. And we're not using the chat box or the raise hand feature. We're using the Q&A box. So if you can enter comments or questions in the Q&A box, I'll be scanning through those as Robert and Vernetta share their thoughts. We have a break at about 2/3 of the way through the content where we'll specifically stop and ask some questions, and we hope to have time at the end as well. Moreover, it's critical that you fill out that short survey that pops up at the end of the session, because we're going to ask you now, based on today, what's most important to you that we cover in session 2 next Monday. So we want this to be very interactive and iterative with you. So let's start by having Robin and Vernetta introduce themselves. Welcome, Robin, Stacia.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks so much, Jean and MPQ, for hosting us. I'm Robin Stacia, based in Atlanta, Georgia, and I am the CEO and principal consultant for Sage Consulting Network. Also have been a partner with Vernetta for many years, dating back to our days with Maryland Association of Nonprofits. I'm a clinical psychologist by profession, and I just welcome you to go to my website and you can see all the other details, because what's important about today is that just like each of you, I hope, in the midst of everything that has been going on, I've said to myself, what can I do? I mean, to the extent where I couldn't sleep, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? And that's what this conversation is about. What can we do? And so I called my colleague and friend Vernetta and I said, I want to have a conversation. I want us to have a conversation with boards and board leaders about what we're called to do in this very important moment in our lives, in our year, where we never anticipated the things that are happening that we would have to face. And she agreed with me and was excited and took it to even the next level to invite MPQ to be partners with us in this conversation. So that's why I am here. I'm excited to talk to all of you, and I'm glad to see right now over 1,400 of you on the call. So clearly you have that same question. And so we're going to answer it today. Vernetta, I'll shift over to you.
Thank you, Robin. And as Robin mentioned, we go back over a decade in terms of knowing each other and working together. I know many of the people on this webinar, or at least some of you know me for my work in the area of nonprofit governance. So I am the governance gladiator, but I also do a substantial amount of work helping organizations who are trying to go deeper in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when Robin called me, one thing that I will say, I think we both had heavy hearts because we both do this work. And something that hit me, that struck me on that day when we had the conversations, I said, I'm seeing all of these organizations put out these statements. And some of them were good. Some of them I was actually excited about, but others I was like, oh my gosh, it rings so shallow. So like, who did they talk to? It has no teeth. what are we supposed to do with this? And out of that came a title for a webinar, but we knew that we wanted to go much deeper. We also know from the conversations we're having with colleagues and clients alike that people are struggling to figure this out. People are trying to figure out how to move forward. So hopefully today we'll make a big dent in that struggle. And that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. And thanks again for inviting MPQ to be a platform for this conversation. So the content that you've put together for us today really falls in these three categories, and it's an important sequence, isn't it? And the first one is really powerful to me, which is debunking common myths and misperceptions. We have a lot of people in the discourse saying, is this moment different? Are we at a tipping point? How do we think about this differently? How do we feel this pressure and do something differently? And part of what I hear you saying is that there's some really persistent myths and misperceptions that are keeping boards stuck as individual board members and as a body in really taking on and confronting the issue of racial justice as it is reflected not only in the work of their organizations, but in how they work together. So we're going to spend some time debunking these common myths and tying those myths to the stuckness or the challenges that boards face in rising to this moment. Then we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to unpack some of the notions of bias and white dominant culture and privilege and how those show up and indeed shift our frame in the wrong direction or impede us from taking the kinds of action, both internal to the organization and external, that this moment calls on us to take. And then we're going to begin the conversation, which will continue in part two, about what does it look like to center racial equity in the boardroom, and in so doing, in the work of the organization. So that's the steps we're going to take today. And we are going to finish today with some very specific guidance around statements and how boards speak to the community. But we're going to build towards that, moving through these steps that you've laid out for us. So I think this is a good time to take a poll and just find out where our audience is. And this question is, has your organization issued a public statement addressing racial equity since the murder of George Floyd? I'll give you a few seconds to answer that. And here are the results, Robin and Vernetta. 70% have issued a statement since the killing of George Floyd. 15% almost have not, and another 16% are in discussion. So very high numbers, and maybe not surprising given how we titled this conversation, that a lot of people, the vast majority of people on this call have been grappling with how to show up, how to articulate their solidarity, what it means for their organizations.
Yeah, that kind of fits, I think, what we expected for sure. When Vernetta and I decided to address this, our minds melded on this topic. Mine was, I don't know if boards understand what a movement is, or how to become a part of this movement, or that the statements that they're making should articulate some commitment to what they're going to do. I'm not clear what direction they're heading in. Even with boards that I work with, very closely, have issued some statements that I felt were hastily put together and in fact didn't reflect really what I know to be the core essence of their work. So, there's a lot of emotional element to what folks are trying to use a statement to convey. And so we're hoping that today we're going to be able to help those of you who haven't written your statement to have some understanding about that, and those who you have written your statement to kind of think about what your next steps are going to be, particularly if maybe some of your board members feel that that statement maybe doesn't actually reflect your current work.
Yeah, let's see how often boards have been involved. Let's take a follow-up poll here. And this question is, if you have or are in the process of issuing a statement, was your board of directors involved in framing it? And we're going to talk some more over the course of this conversation about the tension between boards leading and following on racial justice, because it's a real tension in organizations. Very interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I was surprised at the volume of how frequently
Yeah.
people had issued statements, and now I'm a little bit surprised at how infrequently boards were involved in framing those, or perhaps not surprised. But again, this tension between boards leading and staff leading and executive leading on issues
Mm-hmm.
of racial justice, the timeliness issue that you mentioned, the need to get something out,
Out. Yes.
that feeling that we should get something out. We don't even have a board meeting right now. It's, all those factors come into this. So very interesting.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we're seeing.
I'm sorry. I wasn't surprised that so many organizations had issued a statement. I wasn't surprised by that at all because there was a lot of pressure. And I was also hearing that from a lot of my clients and just people talking like, we need to say something. And then the flip side of that, for organizations that had not had conversations internally, had not issued a statement, there was a lot of quick backlash
Yes.
in terms of why haven't you said anything? Why haven't you done anything? So there was pressure, there was internal pressure, there was external pressure. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, and so I mean, the question is, though, of course, what do these statements mean? We can get very cynical, and NPQ has covered some of this, and we'll continue to cover it, where there are big gaps between corporate statements and corporate behavior. We have a piece up today about corporations funding police unions out of one side of their mouth while they make statements about Black Lives Matter out of the other. So, we have real dangers here, don't we? Now, even in the nonprofit sector, in exploring the gap between the statement and the practices and behaviors of the organization. So, of course, that's part of the ethos of this conversation. But I think where we want to start is right with our title, Robin, which is, how do boards join the movement for racial justice and not take for granted that we know what that means? What do we mean by movement?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is where we want to start, because many nonprofit organizations and corporations who are creating these statements are doing the equivalent to creating your virtual protest sign. That's what your statement is about. You are saying, hey, we've joined the protest. So here in Atlanta, it's equivalent to showing up at Centennial Park, which is where the core of the protests start. But are you really saying you've joined the movement or you've joined the protest? And do you really know what that means? So in our country, movements really came to the forefront. There have been many. There have been the women's voters movement, right? The suffrage movement, if you can think back to that term of the suffrage movement. But the one that rings most for most of us is the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement that worked and coined and framed a strategy around nonviolent protest. So not only was it a movement, but it was a movement that had a specific methodology for how it would work in terms of nonviolent protest, but also coupled with economic deprivation in unity against those institutions that seem to support racial injustices against African Americans in this country. And so when we think back to movements, we have to think that they are multifaceted, that they have various ways in which individuals can be engaged and can approach. They are centered around specific issues. And in this particular movement, we're talking about issues of equity, race equity, justice, social justice. But what's different about this movement, and most are remarking on this, is that this movement, although the civil rights movement was also diverse, the civil rights movement did have a lot of white supporters, but the predominant folks who were on the ground every day in the civil rights movements were from the Black communities. And this movement seems to have more, it seems to be led by our next generations, right? Our Generation X, our millennials. It's very multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, and it is building to a level of persistence. We'll have to see, and we want it to maintain what it needs to do in order to create the results we want. And they also now are beginning to articulate what the ask is. And that's something we're going to pose to you also as boards about the ask. Movements have to have an ask. What do you want? So Vernetta, I think, is going to build on that.
Yeah, Robin and I, we've had a lot of conversations about movements, and I agree with everything that she just said, especially about the civil rights movement. But I've been looking at the more recent movements, and there's something that distinguishes the movements. Definitely, it's the fact that they are both spontaneous and organized all at once. What we saw with the civil rights movement was that there were key leaders, very specific individuals. Some have been selected to be the leaders of the movement. The movements we see today are different. And something that we talked about, I said, and I read, certainly the civil rights movement was the most famous movement of the 20th century. The way this movement has captured the attention of the world and taken off globally, this may very well be the most famous or most the biggest movement of the 21st century. I hope it will be the most successful. Where Robin and I had a little bit of back and forth. She was like, this is just the civil rights movement continued. I said, this is a new thing. And what makes it new, definitely the way that it has come together, but also you mentioned the involvement of people who very diverse people, and also the Generation X and millennials. For on so many levels and across so many issues, I just feel like they're here to save the world. But this is very special. And what's important about a movement and what gets things done is the dispersed leadership. There are those elements of advocacy. There's legal action, the protests, there's research that comes in to play. And media reach. Media has been an important part, I think, of all movements that I can recall, or even and going back. And today, that's what's making it so prevalent, and it's making it catch fire. But that spontaneous, spontaneity around a movement is something that is quite unique. So when we say movement, what's distinguishing that from other really organized efforts that we see? I say sometimes you can't predict it. It springs up, and it's like there has been a tipping point, and that's what we're seeing. I had a colleague who said they wanted to go back and read the tipping point, and so that level of energy, something where everything collides at once to make this feel like this is right, and folks are getting behind it. It makes a difference. So that's part of the movement.
Yeah, I think that what I'm hearing is the dispersed leadership, both the long game and the spontaneous,
Right.
the use of media, the intersectionality that I know you're going to speak to a little bit more, the multiracial movement, all of these dimensions are making this perhaps, I want to pull out another word you said, more persistent. That there's a rising kind of emphasis, and we saw this in the movement, in the protests that continued after the cameras went off, after the policeman was fired, after these quote unquote incidents, right, that the protests continued. There's a more persistent, pervasive notion of what it is we're fighting against and for. So all of these, it seems to me, you're saying, suggest that a board of directors cannot think even unconsciously that they're going to ride this out, that this is, this has been this sort of uprising, and now we either did or didn't respond well, and we can get back to business, or we will get back to business. That's not how we would articulate what's going on here. Do I have that right?
Yeah,
Yes.
you do. And in fact, Jean, you just hit on something that's so important. If we are successful, the bulk of the movement is happening off of the streets. It's happening in the policy rooms. It's happening in the boardrooms. It's happening with our laws. It's happening in spaces where our board members have an opportunity to have an influence and have impact. And we're going to talk about how board members can leverage their roles, their relationships, their positions in order to help the movement as it aligns with their mission. So this
Isn't that
movement,
exciting? Instead of seeing this
yes,
as some sort of test you're failing, you know, in the worst case scenario, seeing it as an opportunity to activate your own learning,
yes,
your networks, to sort of move into the collective power of the board to do something maybe even better than you would be willing or able to do, not willing, but able to do on your own. I need to share with you that of the comments that are coming in so far, there's amazing examples. Amazing is entirely the wrong word. There are noteworthy examples of our white president and white ED issued a statement without us looking at it. Nobody knew what to do, so I was the one person of color on the board and I wrote it, and everything in between, right? So
yeah,
this urgency of the moment colliding with this lack of alignment or readiness
right.
and set of practices in the organization, right? And you know that there's an inevitability to that, but it feels really stark in many of these comments. So what I want to ask you is this notion of, is this a tipping point? You talked about that. And you know, that question is a bit of a trap. We don't know, obviously. You don't know until we move through it, that the call to action is to make it one, right? But we are having a lot of conversation about, is this moment more pressureful, more purposeful? Is there more that we can get done right now? And I want to ask you how you feel about that, Robin, and why.
So I think that there's never been a point in time where an interval of time has been more meaningful to all of us in the same way. 8 minutes and 46 seconds is now ingrained in it is etched in our minds. You know, as a psychologist, you know, we talk about imprinting. It is imprinted into many of us because we watched collectively, we got close collectively to what was likely I don't want to sound, you know, dramatic, but what felt like to me 21st century lynching. We saw a person killed right before our eyes. And that created what Brian Stevenson calls getting proximate. He has two things that he says that we must do in order to create the momentum for change. And this is all boards have to do this. Often the boardroom is our enemy because it prevents us from doing what he calls, which is getting proximate, which is getting close to the people in the communities who are at risk. And I've asked so many folks, what about this time was different for you? And everyone says, because it wasn't that grainy video off in a distance where two people were struggling. And what was also critical about this video was that we saw both persons. We saw not only George Floyd, whose life we saw leave his body right before us, but we also saw the police officer who had his knee on his neck and the others who were accomplices to that. We saw their eyes. We saw their mannerisms. We saw how casually he put his hand in his pocket and then he pressed down again. This 8 minutes and 46 seconds got us close. And then it took us to another place that Brian Stevenson talks about, and that's the willing to do uncomfortable things, because it challenges our very understanding of who we are within the context of humanity. And I will tell you, every board that I work with, and I've worked with hundreds, if not thousands of boards, people are on boards because they want to do good, because they care. They care about their communities. They want to make a difference in their communities. And what a contradiction it would be to watch something so horrific and then not be changed by it, right? Not care. And so this is why, for me, I believe this moment is different. But let's hear from Brian Stevenson, and he'll tell us in his own words.
Hi, my name is Brian Stevenson, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. I'm also the author of Just Mercy. This is a critical moment in our nation's history. There is a need for reckoning with our history of racial inequality and racial injustice that is dramatically on display in our streets. We are a nation that is not free. We have been corrupted, polluted by our long history of racial injustice. There are things we haven't talked about that we need to talk about. We are a post-genocide society. When Native people came to this continent, we killed them by the millions through famine and war and disease, but we didn't call it genocide. We said those Native people are savages, and we used that rhetoric to create this ideology of white supremacy. It allowed us to enslave black people for 2.5 centuries. And the great evil of American slavery wasn't the involuntary servitude, it wasn't the bondage, it was this fiction that black people aren't as good as white people, that black people are less deserving, less evolved, less capable. And that ideology of white supremacy survived the Civil War. I've often argued that slavery doesn't end in 1865, it just evolves. We were promised freedom and the right to vote, but what we received was terror and violence and lynching. For nearly a century, black people were pulled out of their homes, they were beaten, they were hanged, they were drowned, they were menaced and traumatized. That terrorism went uncorrected. It would be the police sometimes that would step away and allow the mobs to pull black people out of the jail and where they would, and then literally lynch them on the courthouse lawn. In the 1950s and 60s, courageous black people challenged this legacy of Jim Crow and segregation, put on their Sunday best to protest nonviolently, and they would pray and they would fight and they would march, and they'd be on their knees sometimes and still get battered and brutalized by police officers. The laws changed, but that narrative persisted. And even today, there is a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that gets assigned to black and brown people. And you can be an actor, you can be a musician, you can be a teacher, you can be a clergy member, you can be an engineer. It doesn't matter how hard you work or how much money you acquire. You will go places if you're black in this country, and you'll have to navigate these presumptions of dangerousness and guilt. I've gotten old enough to tell you that it's exhausting. Things need to change. We need an era of truth and justice in America. We need to commit ourselves to being honest about our past, to reckoning with it. In South Africa, there was a period of truth and reconciliation. In Rwanda, in Germany, there has been truth and justice. In Germany, there are no Adolf Hitler statues. In this country, the American South is littered with the iconography of the Confederacy. Truth and justice is sequential. You can't have truth and reconciliation. You can't have truth and reparation. You can't have truth and restoration at the same time. These things are sequential. You have to tell the truth before you get to the restoration, before you get to the reconciliation. I'm excited because in this moment we have an opportunity to do more, to do better. I believe there's something better waiting for us in America. I think there's something that feels more like freedom, feels more like equality, feels more like justice waiting for us. But to get there, we're going to have to commit to reckoning with our history, to telling the truth about our past, to engaging in important dialogue and conversations. I'm excited that you are having some of those conversations. You are part of this effort. I want to thank you for that and invite you all to come and see us in Montgomery, but more than that, to invite you to continue being part of this process to change America, to lift up truth and justice.
Woo.
Wow. Thank you for that. And I mean, so many things to take from it, but if I can, just to take it through this conversation, the telling the truth first piece, he's saying there's a sequence. We can't jump to or jump over the work. And I think that's a lot of why you wanted to host this conversation, is what is that work in the context of the board? And we have to tell the truth first as organizations about what we have looked away from, what we have benefited from, what we have not even taken the time to gain education and alignment around. And that's this moment for a lot of organizations, is telling that truth inside the boardroom, as you said, Robin, so that we can set on a path, right, towards the kinds of actions that we want to see happen. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to take you through these 3 myths and kind of mindsets or misperceptions that you all have found keep boards stuck and missing the picture and the mandate around racial justice. So we're going to start with this notion of there are a few bad actors. Man, we've heard that language a lot lately, right? Yeah. As it pertains to the police, right? Or to racists as opposed to racism. So Robin, help us understand that and connect it to where boards miss the mark.
Yeah. So, you know, the idea that there are only a few bad actors minimizes exactly what Brian Stevenson talked about. It minimizes the centuries-long struggle that African Americans and brown people, starting all the way back to you know, the original people of this country, have experienced. And what we find is called systemic racism. And we have to name it for what it is. This is one of those things where he says we have to name it. We have to state what it really is. It is not a few bad actors. It is a system of racism that has been, I call it mutating, because it's been mutating for 400 years within this country. At each and every aspect of our country's evolution, racism evolves into some new form of way of restricting the lives of Black and brown people. It is pervasive through every aspect of our institutional societies. So whether it's housing, education, healthcare, our court systems, yes, our criminal justice systems, our politics. It has impacted the wealth distribution and the wealth gaps within this country. And how does systemic racism work? It works through institutional policies, practices, laws, regulations that are all designed to benefit those who, and to create advantages for those who are white, and to create oppression and disadvantages for people of color or for people who are classified in groups of people of color. And so it's Black people, African American people, it's brown people who may be Hispanic, it's poor people. So our systems have been designed to deliver exactly what they do. And Vernetta's gonna walk us through some aspects of how those systems have been performing to create the kind of systemic bondage that many African Americans have continued to experience. And the one unique thing about this is that this, with systemic racism, it's present no matter your age, your race, your age, your race of origin in terms of being an African American, your socioeconomic status. So studies have shown that when they equal for location, geography, for education, for wealth, you find the same types of disparities, the same types of poor outcomes, the same types of systemic impacts on those who have, even as far as what we might consider it, achieved within this country. They still experience and are exposed to those same types of barriers. So Vernetta's gonna, I think, give us a little bit more deeper explanations. But what's important about this slide is that this is the place where nonprofit boards live, right?
Well,
These are the places where we do our work.
Is there a nonprofit on this call whose work doesn't directly or indirectly intersect with these words? And so if we push on the uncomfortable truth, if we go to what Brian Stevenson was saying about telling the truth first, there's just no way not to have a conversation about how our work, our methods, our funding streams, our position in the nonprofit ecosystem, which might be a euphemism in some cases, the word ecosystem, benefits from and contributes to systemic racism. I mean, it's not possible because what you're describing is a water we're swimming in, right? So,
Yeah.
so the question becomes, has your board of directors had that conversation? Does it know how to even talk about the uncomfortable truth of our housing policy, our education policy, our healthcare policy, our mental health care policy, as it actually relates to the clients and issues that it works with? Sorry to
Right.
interrupt, but I think that's
No.
where you're trying to push us is, yes, whether you identify as a racial justice organization or not, you are dealing in systemic racism.
Exactly. And boards have to ask questions about the data that they're seeing. And you have to ask questions about the persistence of the problems that you're addressing and about those who you're serving. And you have to ask yourself, why is it that those who we serve come from this one traditionally, usually African-American community, background, population? You have to ask yourself, what are we designed to do? Yes, we have to meet people in the moment. I mean, we know that with COVID-19 and when so many companies closed and folks were laid off from their jobs, they needed to go to food banks. But we have to say, are we going to continue to just meet people in the moment? Or are we going to dive into work that eradicates the root cause of the very reasons why they are poor, why their educational aspirations are not being achieved, why there's underperformance? Are we going to go there? And that's where the systemic racism lives.
And that's
So,
what
let
joining
me-
the protest means. Shall I move the
So-
slide, Vernetta?
Yes,
Or
move it
No,
on to
no.
Vernetta.
No, you can stay right there. You can stay right there.
Stay
Because
right
as
here?
I was
Okay.
listening, something that occurred to me, and I want to go back to what Brian Stevenson was talking about in terms of truth and reconciliation. So we started talking about what boards should do. Let's start with the individuals, because when it
Yes.
comes to truth and reconciliation, we haven't done that. And there's a lot of understanding that has to occur at the individual, I would say understanding and education and learning or relearning that needs to occur at the individual level. We have not come to terms with, you went to systemic or structural racism, the fact that as a country, collectively, there are a lot of individuals who feel like, you know, after the civil rights movement, that was it. And goodness knows, once we had a Black president, that was it. So everything's all right. So if I'm thinking about truth and reconciliation, yes, we have to talk about structural racism, but let's relearn some things in terms of why we're here. So we're expecting, and we want boards to have conversations about how to address these disparities, how to get at the root cause issues. But let's take a moment and let boards have conversations about why they're so uncomfortable talking about race, why we can't bring it up in the boardroom, and the fact that it takes a level of curiosity and awareness to even question, do you have authentic friendships and relationships with people of color, with African Americans, and Black and brown people? Because we have been separated, we have been segregated, and this was part of a system. I want to give a shout out to Race Equity Institute. I think they do a fabulous job in terms of laying out that history of the role that our government played in setting up these systems. And don't think that these systems were eradicated and went away, whether you want to say 200 years ago or 100 years ago. No, they came and they are still in place today. So what we're seeing is a result of the system working the way it was designed to work. And built into that, our biases, implicit, unconscious bias that a lot of people are not aware of. And what's the default response? If someone says something and they get called on it, the first response, I'm not a racist, okay? Even doing work to understand where you have biases, because to be clear, we all have them. And our actions will belie what we're thinking on a conscious level and also the other thing is, in terms of responses, I'm a good person. So we have developed language and ways of reacting or responding to situations that do not require us to lean in and really investigate and discover the truth. And all of this is reinforced in everything that we see in media, what we were taught in school, our required reading in school. So now we're at this point where we have to undo some things, think differently, have different conversations, and individuals as well as boards are just learning how to do this. So again, we asked some poll questions and it was, are you surprised? We shouldn't be surprised. None of us should be surprised because we have been socialized not to talk about race and to a good extent not to deal with it. So that's something that I will say is exciting about this point in time. And in a lot of ways, it feels like this is a do-over. This is a do-over. And the fact that COVID-19 and this racial or social justice movement collided, it is the perfect storm because people had time to reflect, to be present, and to experience the pain. I'm sorry.
Well, that leads to your next slide.
Well, and again, so much in there, but just if I may, to lift up this notion of individual work, there's a sequence issue there, right? Too, if I'm not doing any individual work, how do I get into the board space for the collective work, right? It's part of what I hear you saying, that we have to have our own curiosity, our own learning agenda, our own reaching out, being vulnerable, whoever we are, to start doing our individual work, or else we can't show up effectively to the collective work of the board.
And to be clear, it may happen together. I'm not saying I want everyone to wait until they have finished their individual journey. And it might be the pressure that it is happening in terms of this pressure to do something, say something, issue a statement, have the conversations. That might force the individual work.
Yes, exactly.
Some people may have that wake-up call that, oh, maybe I am looking through things with a very small, singular lens, and maybe there's another lens that I need to learn how to apply.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Shall I move us to the second myth? Vernetta?
Yes.
Okay.
So the second
Very
myth.
important one. Yep.
How many times lately have you heard someone try to replace the phrase Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter?
Too many.
And definitely. And recently I've been hearing it a lot, which this is another area where there's a fundamental misunderstanding. And when people say Black Lives Matter, it's not to the exclusion of others, but it's almost as though we're saying Black Lives Matter too, or also. And we will be able to say all lives matter if and when we get to the point that Black Lives Matter. Let that sink in, because right now there are everyday examples of how Black bodies and Black lives are disrespected, or there's violence against Black bodies. And quite often, state actors are involved. Sometimes it's other individuals, but quite often it's state actors who are involved, which this goes back to how we have been portrayed over actually centuries, and how we are perceived as individuals. A little bit more about Black Lives Matter. The movement itself, and I went back, I wanted to make sure that I got this clear or accurate, started as a way to bring attention to the violence that was being inflicted on Black communities by police and other actors. It was about creating a world free of anti-Blackness, where every Black person has the social, economic, political power to thrive like everyone else. And clearly we're not there. We're not there yet. So when we say Black Lives Matter, we're not saying that others don't, but goodness, we need to, again, change the narrative so that we understand that here's another thing that we need to understand. I know a lot of people have heard the term race is a social construct, but they don't get it. They still feel like there are differences between the races that would justify some of this. There aren't. So lots of studies, lots of research. There's nothing, I mean, our color is different, but that has more to do with geographic latitude, where your ancestors came from, etc. But as individuals, we are more alike. So there's a lot to unpack, but I wanted to say that this shouldn't we just be saying all lives matter? And that's the misconception or misperception that I'm often having to explain. In this moment, Black Lives Matter is something very specific, and we need to come to grips with it, because across the board, we're not seeing it. Let me give two examples. One that I shared this morning, because I saw it just a couple of days ago in the New York Times, and the title of the article was "Banking While Black: How Cashing a Check Can Be a Minefield." African-American woman goes into the bank in Atlanta, Georgia, to cash a $200 check. 3 employees denied her and called the police, said she had committed fraud. And the woman in the interview, she talks about the fact of being afraid for her life, because now they've called the police. She doesn't know how this is going to turn out. Look at everything else that's going on in this country. But when the police got there, she showed the police officer her ID and her check stub, not to mention that she was a former bank teller or bank employee, so she knew that that was all that was needed. Now, in this case, the police left. But that's not always the case when police are called because there is a Black individual involved and someone feels like something's wrong. We've seen it numerous times. The other case, and as I think of that perfect storm of everything that was on the news as we're all home or self-quarantining or able to see more of what's going on, Mr. Cooper, well, the Coopers, unrelated, but the bird watcher in Central Park. And he asked the woman, just put a leash on your dog. Why that would result in, I'm calling the police, I'm going to tell them I feel threatened for my life by an African-American man. Again, I shudder to think what might have happened if he did not have the wherewithal to turn on his camera. Could have been a completely different outcome. So everyday examples of why we have to say Black Lives Matter. Let me pause and let you jump in, Robin.
Yeah, so those are those microaggressions and even aggressions that Dr. David Williams, who is a researcher out of Harvard, talks about, that Black people experience each and every day. The microaggressions are much more targeted, such as the woman who called the police. The aggressions are very severe, such as what we experience from policing. But this gets to the issue of another term that I think many people are confused with, Vernetta, and that's called race equity. And when you hear terms of Black Lives Matter and racial equity, and the reaction is, what does that mean? Many folks are confused and believe that by pursuing equity for people who are Black and brown, that means that there's less equity for people who are white, that this is, again, a myth and it is untrue. Really what the call is here, in light of what you're saying, is that the conditions where my identity, my racial identity, has no influence over how I fare in society. That's what race equity is about. It's about, can I go bank? And that the fact that I'm Black, it doesn't have any impact on my ability to have a successful transaction. Because when you think about the day-to-day, and Dr. Williams calls them daily slights. That was a daily slight. The day-to-day interactions that individuals experience accumulate into these daily slights. And these daily slights are all driven by the fact that, or most often driven, by the fact that the condition of your racial identity dictates the outcome of your ability to fare well within the society. And so racial equity means we want everyone and Black people to have fair and just and impartial ability to fare well, to thrive, to do the best and accomplish what they choose and have decided to do, on whether it's cash a check, it's go to college, it's apply for a job. That's what this triggers. This is about racial equity, and this is about racial justice. And so you'll hear those terms as well.
And before we get off of that, because you know there's someone who's thinking, well, wait, everyone can go to college now, get a job, etc. And then there are the exceptions, the Oprahs and the others who are, you know, they're held out as the examples. That doesn't mean that we have race equity. And your explanation of everyone being able to fare in society, even, I want to say, regardless of race, well, your outcomes aren't determined by your race. And that's what we're seeing now. Going back to Dr. Williams, something that he said that really stuck with me. Waking up being Black is just a level of stress that they can now measure, and it impacts your lifespan, your life expectancy. Mm-hmm. And that scared me. That the fact that I wake up Black, I'm going to live a shorter life because I'm dealing with more stress on an everyday basis. The fact that we have data that really shows that we still have gaps in terms of educational achievement. And that's so when we start disaggregating data, we see all types of patterns. Black mothers, a much higher mortality, what is it, maternal morbidity or mortality, yeah.
Infant mortality rate.
Well, not the infant, the mothers. The mothers.
With both, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So as we look at, and also the involvement of Black people in the criminal justice system, the fact that if you look at maybe Black males account for maybe 14% of the population generally in the U.S., but 50% of the incarcerated population. Mm-hmm. And how did bias and how did all of these other structures and systems come into play to produce that result? So when we talk about race equity, there's work to do in terms of looking at these systems and correcting these systems so that we truly can achieve a level of equity.
And I think, again, to connect it to the nonprofit sector, there are many, many places where the nonprofit sector very actively intersects with policing and the criminal justice system, whether it's domestic violence, other kinds of interventions. So there's a lot to unpack here. And if we just took this slide into the boardroom and said, what does it really mean that Black Lives Matter? How does that show up in our work? Where are we complicit? Where are we not active enough? I would think it would spark conversations for months on end, and we hope that it does. I'm going to move us to this third myth before we get to some of the issues around statements themselves. The third myth is "this too shall pass," which I thought was really just provoked me right from the moment I saw it, because it touches on that nonprofit hopefulness thing. Right. That, you know, we're just going to carry on and this too shall pass, and that can be a form, can it not, of avoidance and collusion, to say, well, this too shall pass, you know.
Absolutely. And I'm going to try to take this very quickly because I know that we want to get to some questions, Jean. Mm-hmm. And again, Brian Stevenson set us up for this, where he said, I feel that this is an opportunity. He said, I feel that we have an opportunity to create a new America. So we actually don't want this to pass. And we certainly don't want it to pass and to revert back to status quo, because status quo did not benefit a large percentage of Americans in this country who are Black and brown people. And, you know, there's an allegory. If those of you who are familiar with allegories, it's a fancy way of saying a story that the Racial Equity Institute created that helps us to understand why this too shall not pass unless we do a lot of work, okay? The allegory is the allegory about the fish, the lake, and the groundwater. And I'm going to do this very quickly. We're going to send this out to you as well so that you all will be able to read it and discuss this allegory in your boardrooms, because I want you to see who your fish, where your lake, and where your groundwater is. So imagine you have a home, and behind your home, there's a lake. You go out one day, and there's a dead fish in your lake. And you think to yourself, wow, I have a fish that died. You go back in your house. The next day you come out to your home, and not only do you have one dead fish, but you have multiple dead fish in your lake. And you say to yourself, wow, there's something in my lake that's killing my fish. Imagine you're in one of those very nice communities where actually everybody has a lake behind their homes, and they go behind their homes and there are dead fish everywhere. You all would have to collectively say, what is common about our lake that is causing all of our fish to die? So for example, what is common about our school systems? You may say there's one child that doesn't perform well. Wow, that's just one child who doesn't get the support that he or she needs at home. One child who parents aren't helping them with their homework. One child who maybe has special needs. Maybe there's a whole school where the children are unperforming. And then you might say, wow, there's something happening in that school. Those teachers are not the best. Those children are not supported. There's something happening in that particular school. But what if it's an entire school system? What if it's an entire country of school systems where the same kind of fish, not all the other fish, but the same kind of fish seem to be dying? Those fish are not doing well at all. And what if in fact those fish aren't doing well in the school systems, but they're also not doing well in other areas of their lives? You would then have to say something is contaminating those fish. This is what they call the groundwater. The groundwater that is contaminating the fish in our scenario is racism. We talked about systemic racism a couple of minutes ago. And so the reason that this too shall not pass is because until we get to the groundwater issue, and so I want you to think about the work that you do within your board. Who are your fish? What's your lake? And what are the racism groundwater issues that you have to deal with? You can't just continue to say it's just one fish, it's just this street, it's just this school, it's just this hospital, it's just this employment advisor. No, it's all of these things connected that create the groundwater that continues to perpetuate the system where even if you fix it in one point, those same fish then are find barriers in others. And that's that intersectionality that we've been talking about. So we've had opportunities, right, to improve things. I tell everybody, I am a Head Start baby. If you're not familiar with Head Start, it started in the 60s. It was a way to get low-income families, children, a head start on going to school. And so the theory was that children weren't prepared, we'll give them free preschool, right? So what if you do Head Start and you get free preschool? And then those children who got the free preschool go into a school system that has no books, that has no windows, that has the largest class sizes. Why? Because our schools are still funded based upon the distribution of funds that go to the local school that come out of taxes for that school. So our school system set up an inequity because what? We already know, we redline, right? Or we now we loan line. So we only allow people to live in these segregated pockets. And so these segregated pockets then funnel a less than equitable amount of money back into the school systems. So when you begin to look at your fish, you need to look at your lake, you need to look at your groundwater so that you can really define boards where you have to do your work and where your work lies.
I love that. And I know that's going to stick in all of our heads. Who are our fish? What are our fish? What's our lake? And I can't even imagine the billions and billions and billions of dollars on education, quote, reform, just to pick up the issue that we have spent without centering race equity. It's just a tragedy, right? I mean, in that analysis, and where are we for all of that investment, all of that business thinking, without having really understood where our fish, who our fish, and what are our lakes, to a big enough degree. There are so many comments and questions, and so we're going to pause here, and I'm going to pose a couple to you. One of them is about the role of people of color on the board. I think in many of our participant organizations, they're the minority. In some cases, they've been called on to review the statement, right? Sometimes they've been called on to not only review the statement, but then to help figure out what the activities are after the statement, right? And I think it's worth having both of you as board members and equity teachers and models and strategy, all of that. Like, how do we think about the role of people of color on boards and how they are or are not tapped, over-tapped, the assumptions that are made about what they should or should not contribute in these moments?
So I'm dying to jump in on this one.
And I'll come in after you.
Yeah. I do think that when we have people of color on boards, Black and brown people, that it does at least create an opportunity to have some different conversations. And I say that because quite often when you have some diversity in your board, and I'm just speaking to diversity, you might be able to negotiate some of the blind spots. That being said, it does not negate the need for everyone to do their own work. And in fact, if there's one Black person on the board, don't rely on that person for everything. Number one, they're not speaking for an entire population. Number two, depending on what's going on, when we are constantly going to this one person to provide all the answers, especially in an environment like this, which is really charged and emotional, we risk re-traumatizing that individual. And what I mean by that, there was a great article, I'll just say a good article. I posted it on my LinkedIn, and the title was "Maintaining Professionalism in the Age of Black Death is ... a lot." The fact being that we're seeing so much, we're experiencing so much. And I remember writing, I said, I have so many emotions right now, I'm not even sure I could name them all. And a lot of people resonated. They reached out, they spoke to that. So having the one Black person own the work, that's not appropriate. That's not appropriate. It's not saying that they won't step into that space, work with you, show up and bring their opinions and thoughts, and even help you understand from a different perspective. But it's not for that one or two individuals to own the work that you must do as a board and that the organization must do.
Right. You know, in fact, it really, the power to change, the power to achieving racial equity and to getting to the groundwater is, yes, absolutely having a diverse board. So we want, and that is one of your actions, is to look at your board composition and to create a board that is truly diverse and inclusive. But we also recognize that there is power in a diverse voice, which is why those who are out walking on the streets now with the Black Lives Movement, it is so impressive to see the diversity that is there. This morning we woke up, for those of you who've heard the news, to hear that the only Black NASCAR driver who came out and helped NASCAR in the practice of flying the Confederate flag, found a noose in his car garage this morning. Well, he can find a noose in his car garage this morning because he was the only spokesperson for this issue. But if it had been a committee, a team, a coalition of Black, white, brown, all multi-ethnic, multiracial people who said, we do not want to fly a Confederate flag at NASCAR events, then it would not have been just his issue, but it would have been their issue. So the last thing I'm going to say on this question is I got a really timely email from one of my clients this morning. And this is what she wrote in her email. She said, Black people have been fighting for 400 years for freedom from racism and institutionalized racist practices. And you are weary. It's time for white people to also put their hands on the sword of justice and help lift the cause. Ooh. And that's what needs to happen on boards. What needs to happen on boards is, and she is a white woman, is for this perspective to be fulfilled through your work, your voice, your representation, your committee work, and your efforts when it comes to moving your race equity agenda forward.
And period, right? I mean, the phrase is sort of, if I'm paraphrasing, come get your people, you know? I mean, the work that white people need to do to put their hand on the sword of justice is immense. And I'm gathering from just, you know, who's on the call and what I'm hearing, that a lot of the people on this call have majority white boards. And so this is the call to action. Yes. How do you put your hand on the sword of justice? How do you start? And you don't wait, as Vernetta said, till all your individual work is done and everything's all lined up perfectly. You start, right? You start. Let's take a poll that's not about issuing a statement, but is about, have you had the discussion? And this question is very specific, so I invite you to be honest. Has your board, the full board, had an in-depth discussion about the protests, right? So not, but the protests and racial justice and the implications of what this social movement that's happening right now for your work? Has your board had that conversation?
While they're answering, Jean and Robin, I just want to raise up a question that I saw in the Q&A. It was scrolling and I can't find it again. But I know that the individual mentioned that, speaking of schools and funding, that in Baltimore, there's more money allocated to students than what we would see even in Montgomery County. So how do we explain, and I'm looking for the comment, the question again, the discrepancy. And I think the person is saying, or probably referring to maybe there's still a big achievement gap, even though more money is being funneled into the schools. And I wanted to lift that up because this really speaks to the fact that there are other social determinants at play, other than how much the school gets, and all of these systems work together. It's just like in healthcare, someone may show up presenting with one issue, but when you look at all of the other social determinants and factors in terms of where do they live, what is the environment, do they have access to even a grocery store, because in some communities, in some neighborhoods, they don't have access to fresh foods. You have to go a distance, and that's something we have to unpack, all of these things. So I just wanted to say that while we were waiting, and you may want to add to it.
No, that actually was perfect. That it's not academic achievement is not just based solely on the amount of money that is given to a school. That has some bearing on it, because of course that impacts how many teachers they can hire, the kind of renovations and upkeep they can do to their school building, and how they can make the learning environment the most ideal. But that doesn't get anything to do with whether or not the community, the housing where individuals go, do they have Wi-Fi? Do they have parents who are working in the evenings and not able to help them with their homework. All of these other complex, like Vernetta said, do they have dinner when they get home? We don't know all of these other, that's that intersectionality. And that gets to my groundwater example, that if you only fix one thing, so if you only, I mean, you gave us a great example, if you only put more money in schools, but you don't look at where the groundwater is contaminated with racist and institutional barriers along the way, you're not going to get the results you want because you only addressed one lake. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. And this poll result is very distressing.
Wow.
Given it's basically the inverse of how many people have issued a statement. So it gets right at, unfortunately, right at that gap between what we're saying and what we're doing. And I do want to just focus on, we're talking about nonprofits, nonprofit volunteer boards of directors who are not stepping up yet to have this conversation, even as they issue statements or even as their staff issues statements. So that's where we are, right? Yeah. Again, it's not to, I know there are wonderful exceptions in the audience, but as an aggregate, we are woefully behind. And you talked about it, Vernetta, earlier, in knowing how to have the conversation. Although I'm kind of getting impatient with that, just start. You're not going to be perfect, but yes, this notion of knowing how to have the conversation and frankly pushing the rest of the stuff off the agenda. What in the world else would you be talking about this month? Quite frankly, what if you had a board meeting this month and didn't talk about this? I'm not sure what to tell you. I mean, what else does it take to move this conversation to the center? So let's let me close this and let me move us to
the action.
Yeah, and to this question, I mean, we just saw the data. Lots of statements, not a lot of in-depth conversations inside the boardroom. Are statements a legitimate means? Are they a legitimate action into the movement? What do you both think? And if so, what do they need to look like? Not what do they need to look like? What is the process that is a legitimate step into the movement?
So there are a lot of ways that we can enter this conversation. Are they a legitimate way for boards to join the movement? I would say it's possible that it is a step, one step, but it's really about doing the work. And that's what I think really triggered me early on, as every time I opened my email, here's some corporation sending me their statement that says essentially, we stand with you, Black Lives Matter. I'm like, what, are you just standing there raising your fists? What are you doing? But then there were other statements that were well thought out and you could click through, and it was organizations saying, this is what we've been doing this is what we've done so far, and this is what we are willing to hold ourselves accountable to. This is what we're going to do moving forward. That's different. Another thing about the statements, and this was again the backlash that some organizations received early on. There was a lot of backlash to go around. It was backlash if you didn't say anything. It was backlash if you spoke out and you didn't say the right thing. There was backlash if your statement didn't have any teeth. So that just signals that people are paying attention. Mm-hmm. And they want more than lip service. So this is really about, is it legitimate? Have the conversations, do the work, look internally as well as externally. And those who really rushed to get something out, it was all about public perception rather than reflecting on where are we at this moment in time? What does this mean for us, our community, our stakeholders, our staff, those inside the organization? Are we upholding our end of the bargain as far as they're concerned? So there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, have we asked our Black staff any questions about that gap between our public articulation and their internal experience of our work? Robin, did you want to add anything on the notion of statements? I think I'll move the slide one so we can keep talking about statements for a second and what they can lead to. It's not just the statement, but the kinds of conversations and commitments they can lead to.
Right. And while you move, I just want to say a couple of things about internal work. We've talked about that quite a bit, and I was scrolling through the Q&A as well, and I saw someone who made a comment about it's not fair or appropriate to put someone on your board just for the sake of diversity. And so I don't think, first of all, I want to make sure that you know that's not what we said. What we're saying is it's also not fair to not put people on the board for the sake of diversity. So it's not fair to just have an all-white board, and we don't want, and that kind of thing has to end. I mean, it has to. So what we're saying, and there's three things that internal work mean to me, and I'm going to say them very quick. One is you have to be a responsible board. And responsible means that you have to work collectively and individually to understand that 75% of you who said you had no meaningful conversation, to understand what racism, equity, racial equity, all of these concepts mean to you and to your work on your board, with your organization. You're partnering with your staff to affirm what we call a shared understanding. What does this mean for our work? And board members, you are moving this to another level. You are creating what we call a board composition, or some way of understanding who you have on the board, what your gaps are, and what you need. And this is both racial, gender, age, professional. So this is all those things. So no, nobody wants to be plunked out like, hey, we just need a person of color on our board. But also here in Atlanta, I cannot tell you how many people I've heard say to me, we can't find a Black person for our board. When this is, the place where there are more board serving, philanthropic professionals who are ready and stand ready to serve on the boards. The problem is that boards are still finding your board members in the same internal, which is also unjust way that you have all along. And I'm saying what I say to you, that I say to the boards I work with, it's unjust because it's unfair, because it centers around something like this, like who do we know?
Who are we comfortable with?
Who are we comfortable with?
Is this person a good fit?
Is this person a good fit? Do we think this person can really bring money? These are all very limiting frames. They are sometimes prejudice frames. They are sometimes frames based upon myth and misinformation. And they are frames that are not racially accurate about the individuals that you want to bring onto the board. So you're assigning stereotypic beliefs often to those who don't look like those around the table. And board, you have to move beyond that. You have to move to a space where you're identifying your board members through a pipeline strategy that is not based upon those people you know, but those people that you need to know. And those people that need to be on the board in order to bring the kinds of diverse conversations and leverage their resources and to help you to be stronger allies. The second is, board, you have to be aware. And this is where you really have to understand and believe these facts that we've shared with you. And you have to learn them for yourself. So you have to go to the Race Equity Institute. You have to bring in a trainer, establish a book club, start to read. There's so many things to read out there that can help move you along the way of understanding. But you really have to look at your own data and you have to understand your community. So the internal work, the responsible work, is to understand your own community. And then like Vernetta said, if you don't have your own friends who you can sit around with and talk to and help to understand what's going on, then you have to begin to create those networks. And then the last is boards have to work to be impactful. So, and this gets to the comment Vernetta's gonna walk us through, and that's, well, what are you gonna do? You know, what's really your call to action? So I'm gonna shift over to her to kind of take that part home.
Great. So we have about 7 minutes, and Vernetta is going to help us think through what should it. You talked about clicking through. Where's the action in these statements? Where's the commitment?
Mm-hmm. So a couple of things, just to lay the foundation, and actually just to also reiterate that part 2, next Monday, we are getting much more detailed about doing the work.
Yeah.
But big picture, some things to consider. If your organization hasn't had the conversation yet, it's time to have the conversation. And I say the organization, we're focused on the board. Jean, I think you had mentioned earlier, like on the first slide, what's the role of the board chair, the ED, et cetera. Something that we do see is misalignment across organizations in terms of who's ready to get out there and do the work. And quite often it is the staff that is out front. When I'm working with organizations, I feel it is imperative to understand where the board stands, because the board has a unique opportunity to set the tone at the top. And if they haven't done their work, it's not that the staff is, hand-tied and can't do anything, but it will definitely impede their efforts. So sitting down as a board and really leaning into your mission to understand the work that you need to do. It's not about, one size fits all. No, look at your mission and what you're trying to accomplish, because at the end of the day, as the board of an organization, you're trying to advance the mission. And what we're saying here is that there are opportunities, maybe even untapped opportunities to do things differently that are going to have a much deeper impact for the communities that you serve and work with. Just holistically, having the conversation. And if you get to that point where you can really articulate your priorities, I frame this a lot of different ways. Like, if we're saying that equity, racial equity in particular, is a priority for us as an organization, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. What must we do as a result of that? How do we go about it? How do we really make the commitment as an organization and spell that out? What are our guiding principles? What are our imperatives? And just like if you were doing strategic planning, I want to make this, give you something else to anchor this. When you're doing strategic planning and you may have some goals and objectives, then you have to think about how are we resourcing that in terms of making this a priority for everyone across the organization, so that everyone has some buy-in, some accountability, and even financial resources to get it done. So in terms of the board's work, and I need to save the last few minutes for at least a few more questions, start with the conversation, identify how it relates to mission, understand that there still may be that individual learning that has to occur, but don't be afraid to articulate your priorities and know that some accountability needs to come along with that.
What I love about this list, and thank you for sourcing Robert Dorch there, is that, and some of you have said this in your comments, if you come at this process as a process, not just to produce a statement, hurry up and produce a statement, but as a process that is a movement entering or movement amplifying process, then you really sit down and answer these questions in a way that's specific to the work you do and locates your organization on its own racial justice journey, right? So the answers become much more specific. What are we looking at in our own work or ways of doing the work to change in question 5? What can you hold us accountable to? So it becomes, you talked about strategic planning. I mean, this if you did it this in depth, it could surface a kind of work plan or set of priorities that could begin the work for you, and that connected that work outside the boardroom to the very mission and services or programs of the organization. That's how I heard you when you walked through that. What an opportunity that would be. The statement may come out of it, or many of you already put out a statement, but if you didn't, as a group, go through these questions, you can still do that.
Exactly. It's what I call an equity strategic action plan. And it doesn't develop overnight. It takes, as Vernetta just walked everyone through, it really takes your full board and your staff's engagement into really identifying, what does this mean to the work that you're doing? But yes, we ideally want you to be able to to measure your work, to have strategies that that move your work from point A to conclusion, that allow you to be able to see how maybe some of the old lines of work that you were doing, you no longer have to do because you've been instrumental in creating some meaningful and systemic change. And then you're able to shift your work to even different levels. So we have to begin to really systematically work at changing our work.
Yeah, and
that means we're improving.
But you're helping me realize that a frame that I think is so ready to go to the curb is, are we a service organization or an advocacy or justice organization? That frame has plagued us as a sector, and it hints at, or doesn't even hint at, it screams at this neutrality of service, the supposed neutrality of service, when in fact, everything we're talking about here is how do our services fit into this notion of systemic racism? What is the root cause? What are the fish in the lake that require our services? So I hope that this racial justice lens and equity plan push that aside and get to the root, right, of what it is that we're trying to do, what it is we're trying to change, whether we identify as a advocacy organization or a service organization. Vernetta, do you want to speak in our last minute a little bit to what we anticipate might be some of the topics for next Monday?
Well, I know that we're going to look at some of these questions, but I think it is about understanding how to more intentionally approach the work, and how do you even set the stage for that. This is work that, like I said, it feels very uncomfortable, but and those groups that I work with, I say that's a good thing, because the more uncomfortable we get, the higher the likelihood, there's a greater likelihood that we're about to learn something together. So how do we do the work? What does it look like? And as I'm reading the Q&A, lots of folks are looking for examples and statements, and there's a lot in there. But part 2 is about doing the work, and also thinking about how do you apply an equity lens to the work that you're doing. So that's a whole other level. When you start looking at everything you do, and especially your external relationships with an equity lens. So I think that's going to be a really important part of next week's conversation.
Wonderful. So we have 2 sources, as you said, you both have said, many of the comments in the Q&A are questions, but a lot of them are comments and descriptions of the situations that folks have found themselves in vis-a-vis creating a statement, board recruitment, et cetera. So we're going to take all of that. In addition to what you're about to answer on this evaluation, there's a question that says, what do you really hope we cover next time? Take all the Q&A data and that data and fold that into the planning for session 2. Robin and Vernetta, thank you so much. Thanks for all of the work and heart and experience that went into this session. And again, for using NPQ as a platform for this conversation. And we'll see you next Monday.
All right, thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us.